when we started this session, we looked for a theme, and we came for infrastructure foundations of wellbeing to fit in with the theme of the conference. By the way, I'm Robert Smith, and Vice President, one of the Vice Presidents of the Economic Society of New South Wales. One of the reasons for that Foundations of Wellbeing title was its breadth, because when you think about foundations, if this was an engineering conference, we could be into nice, solid, concretes and digging up dirt and sort of heavy machinery lifting. But as we are indeed a room of economists, as someone said the other day, possibly a confusion of economists, whatever the group noun is for economists, foundations can cover a lot of things. So we're talking not only this sort of forward program of large investments, such as Infrastructure Australia, that Phil stewards, looks after. We're also talking the part that I know Phil and Tony particularly are also interested in, is the other foundations we have for infrastructure and wellbeing, and they can include the institutional, the regulatory, and the social frameworks and foundations that you get for infrastructure. So if you are after a very detailed engineering discussion of infrastructure, you're probably in the wrong room. But if you're just interested in a conversation that covers that bigger picture, we're hoping we'll have a very wide-ranging and entertaining session. So first of all, I will do a quick introduction to Phil. Now, the interesting thing about Phil is that he actually is an engineer, so all those things I just said, he could come up here and talk, tensile steel and quick forming concrete if I can. But that's not the case. He has a background as the CEO of Infrastructure Australia. I think it's fair enough to say that it's a body that is providing rigour to the decisions that are being made about infrastructure in Australia. If anyone saw the presentation from the Grattan Institute, I think it's Lucille Danks was presenting on the paper about overruns in infrastructure projects, and one of the things they were doing there was showing the number of government announcements at elections that were and weren't part of Infrastructure Australia's assessed program. So what it means is there is a huge body. So there is a bit of an overlap between Infrastructure Australia and the Grattan Institute on those two things. But what we find is we have actually a huge program of infrastructure happening in Australia. You only need to walk around the streets of Sydney to see that. We also have huge demands for infrastructure, for population growth and increase in GDP. So what we have is a sort of the classic case of limited resources for almost infinite needs. The priority list that Infrastructure Australia has and the rigour it puts into looking at those programs is part of where we're seeing good economics applied to what in some cases have been sort of less well-structured policy decisions. So in terms of Philip's background, he has been, I'll just double check my notes, 2011 is I think, when you started CEO, but previously was a transport background working for Transport for London and a range of engineering, and also, at ACOM as a senior advisor on infrastructure projects. So I welcome him to this forum. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert, and thanks for inviting me into this ecosystem of economists. As Robert said, I am an engineer, so please forgive me for that. It's great to be here, and what I'd like to do, well, first of all, I'd like to invite those in the dark at the back to move forward, because we're going to have a panel session. It would be really good to have a conversation, so feel free to come up to the front. And what I'd like to do, though, is just give you a bit of an...
Who you are.
Yeah, we know who you... Robert knows who you are. What I'd like to do is give a bit of an overview of what we at Infrastructure Australia have been up to in recent times, and also acknowledge my colleagues in the audience, particularly our Chief Economist, Anna Chow. We, as Robert said, we're the nation's independent advisor on infrastructure matters, and one of the things we do through that providing that advice is advise on getting the right infrastructure investments at the right time at the right place, and that's through maintaining a priority list. Over the last 6 months, we've been evolving those processes and particularly focused on, frankly, simplifying our assessment framework that we provide to project proponents to give them guidance around what we'd like to see coming forward in business cases. And I think we've also, back at the start of the year in February, refreshed the priority list. And that's really been a big piece of work over the last two and a half years off the back of doing a national audit. So some of you may know that our legislation changed in 2014 and established us as an independent body. So we're completely independent with an independent board. And from that, one of the requirements from that point was to do an audit every 5 years. So it's really important because that's given us a solid evidence base from which to do our work. One of the other things we're required to do is produce infrastructure plans. So we released a 15-year infrastructure plan back in February 2016, and that really laid out the reforms that we need to see in the infrastructure sector over the next 15 or so years. In more recent times, we followed that reform document up with a number of pieces of policy work. So we don't just assess projects, we also do policy work, and there's a strong linkage between our policy work and actually making the investment process more sophisticated and informing the investment decisions. Some of the more recent work we've been doing is around value capture, where we released a paper last December. And that was really around bringing some reality to the large debate that seemed to be going on around value capture and actually grounding it in some practical reality. The other work we've been doing more recently is around public transport franchising. And also we just released a few weeks ago a paper on corridor preservation. So that just gives you a kind of flavour of some of the things that we've been focused on in the last few months. In terms of the theme of this conference, and today though it's all about improving well-being, and that's certainly front and centre of the work that we do. As Robert said, if you want to learn about steel and concrete, let's talk to an engineer, and I'm happy to field questions in the panel. But actually, in terms of the work Infrastructure Australia does, it's very much around improving the quality of life of all Australians. It's around maintaining the livability of our cities, and really doing that through getting the urban planning right, and thinking about how we're connecting communities and ensuring we've got reliable energy supplies and clean water to drink. So we don't just cover transport. Often we talk a lot about transport because that's the most unreformed sector that we're dealing with, and a lot of our focus is necessarily on transport. A lot of the projects we get, therefore, because we don't have the market structures of energy and water, a lot of the projects we get are transport projects, so we tend to always focus on transport. But as an organisation, we look after energy, water, telecommunications, and transport, obviously, but also we have a role in social infrastructure. The only infrastructure we don't get involved in actually is defence. So one of our other roles, therefore, which is really primarily the conversation today, is assessing business cases. So any Commonwealth investment over $100 million, then it's a requirement that the proponent, which is generally speaking a state or territory government agency, sends us their business case, and we assess the business case. As I mentioned, we have some guidelines and frameworks that they follow to make sure they meet our requirements. And one of the things that's certainly evolved with the organisation over the last 18 months to 2 years is we're spending a much greater percentage of our time now giving advice to proponents around how to structure the business cases, what kind of things we're expecting to see in the business cases. And I think the good news from that is that we're seeing a steady improvement in the quality of the business cases that we get, and that's got to be good. And I think we're certainly in a unique position as a kind of national body to see what's evolving around the country, not only from a business case point of view, but also a planning point of view. Increasingly, we're getting involved earlier in the process, which is also good. It means we can help shape a more sophisticated approach to some of these projects. Certainly, it's worth saying that the establishment of state-based infrastructure bodies has been very welcome, and we work very closely with those bodies, and it's undeniable that that's making a good contribution to improving the quality of the business cases as well. So, improving the quality and the sophistication of business cases is something that's front and center for us. And really, it's not rocket science. What we're really looking for is a greater sense of strategic alignment, a stronger evidence base, and greater transparency. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those. So in terms of the strategic alignment, often in the past we've seen projects that have been a project looking for a problem to solve. First and foremost, we want to see what's the problem we're trying to solve, how do we measure that problem, and what are the options that we're considering to solve that problem. Basic stuff. Often our colleagues, the proponents, the economists doing the work for them, are under a lot of pressure to deliver business cases in a short space of time, and often some of these steps are skipped. We're really going back to basics and saying, the first question we generally ask when we meet with the proponent is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And making sure that we're following a proper options assessment process, and we're not just getting the base case and a preferred option, which has often been the case in the past. So as part of that options assessment process as well, what we'd like to see is greater exploration of those broader options, and I think particularly in the current fiscally constrained times, a greater consideration of better use of existing assets. So there's some of the things that we're focused on right now in terms of the the first step of the process. So then when it comes to the evidence base, I think certainly the work that Infrastructure Australia did 2.5-3 years ago in doing an audit has helped raise the level of engagement around the evidence base, and it's fair to say that the work we're able to do at a national level is in terms of getting evidence is much harder than it is for our state colleagues. So we rely very much on working with the state colleagues to gather the evidence, to do the analytics, and actually make sure that, as well as presenting the business case, we're getting a broader sense of what the future planning opportunities are. We're getting a better sense of what's being done from a demand modelling point of view, and just understanding those assumptions that go into the business case, and also increasingly around the costs as well, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So I think there's been good, in summary, around that kind of evidence base. We've got more data today, or over the last year and this year. I think it's fair to say globally we're collecting more data than we've collected in the whole of history up until that point. There's no excuse for not having data these days. So we've got the data. We just need to raise the level of the sophistication of the analysis and take the time to present that as part of the case. In terms of the transparency piece, and that's really the final one of the three I wanted to talk about. As you probably know, we're very keen that proponents publish business cases for their projects. That's still not custom and practice. We're certainly transparent in terms of the work we do, and our assessments are published on our website when we've completed them. We'd like to see a greater transparency around all the data that's underpinning a business case, cash flow spreadsheets, Excel models, and so on. That enables us to actually do a more sophisticated job of doing our own assessment. We don't just rely on the information provided by the proponent. We do our own analysis as well. We don't calculate BCRs. Often that gets confused. What we're actually doing is looking at the sensitivity of the BCR and actually doing the analysis to understand the basis of the assumptions and the benefits, but also look in a greater level of detail at the costs these days as well. So the more information we're provided, the better job we can do. It makes the whole process more streamlined. I think I will say, in terms of the process, often it seems often it can be represented that we take a long time to do our assessments, and we've recently changed the way we communicate this on our website. And more often than not, we're not perfect, by the way, but more often than not, we can wait months for more information from proponents, which is extremely frustrating, and that's why we make the plea to our colleagues around the country: bring us in early, tell us what your approach is, let us understand what the broader analysis is that you've done, the planning information, let us see it. The more we can get across that early, the better, and just make the process less painful for everybody, and more efficient, and ultimately get a much better outcome for the users. In terms of the well-being, obviously, what we're focused on is user outcomes and taxpayer outcomes. There are two primary areas of focus, and that's why we exist, to actually give that advice to government. So just in closing, one of the things we observed last year, I think we saw around 18 business cases, or we certainly published 18 business cases last year, or assessments of business cases. And one of the things we observed through doing that were a number of common issues in developing the business cases. And rather than kind of sit back and complain, we took a kind of probably a unique step of going around the country and presenting some of those issues to not only consultants but also our state and territory colleagues, to try and just generally raise the bar in terms of the quality of the work that's being done. So we're going to continue that. It was well received. We're going to continue that kind of process, and welcome feedback from people in the room today in terms of if you experience that, or actually welcome feedback in the areas you think we can actually do a better job, because ultimately we all want to get the best outcomes for users and taxpayers. So I think I've spoken way too long, but hopefully that's given you a few things to think about and some questions to ask. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Just a quick question. What's the current forward program, or in terms of priorities, in terms of dollars? Do you, off the top of your head, we're talking?
Does this work? Yeah. So in terms of the current priority list, there's two designations on the list. One is projects and one is initiatives. In terms of the projects, I think there's something in the region of $60 billion worth of projects on the list. Some of those already have funding commitments, but many don't. In terms of the initiatives, I think it's something in the region of 200 billion. I'm getting a thumbs up, so that's right. 200 billion in terms of the initiatives, but that's a high-level guesstimate, because it depends on what the final projects look like.
Yes. I just want to make sure anyone who felt like falling asleep, $200 billion, enough to keep you awake for quite a while. Yeah. It's a huge mandate to look at in an amazingly interesting area. So before we sort of do the full panel and throw it open to you, I would love to have Tony Wood up. Now, Tony has been in the Grattan Institute. He's been there for 11 years. I think, hands up, anyone here from South Australia? No, they couldn't make the flight over. So if you're from South Australia, you probably wouldn't need to know much about electricity issues. Having said that, if you're in Sydney and you've looked at your electricity bill recently, you probably would not, or you've read the papers lately, or seen a blog, or watched a TV news show any time in the last year, 3, 4, 5. Tony's been at the Grattan Institute looking after energy policy since 2011, and previously from that was at Origin. And I think it's safe to say there's probably not been a month or maybe even a week in that period he's been there when there hasn't been some sort of electricity issue on the front page of the papers in the news. So both in your professional roles as economists and in your personal experience as consumers, users and bill payers of electricity products, I'm sure there's a lot that Tony can add. I think also for some people there is who aren't, and I should confess, previously I used to work for Ausgrid, so I was in the industry. For people who don't have a feeling, I think one of the things that Tony can actually help give you a feel is the depth of issues that do get carried across electricity, and how that, particularly as there are the interplay between market structures that have been set up and regulatory structures, between institutions, between different goals that are sought around universal service provision of electricity, its role as an essential service, between technology, between environmental policy. You've got I think I used the word before for this session, we talk about it as a smorgasbord of issues between Tony and Phil that we can take. But I'll give you, now Tony, give you a bit of a taste into the exciting world of wellbeing, infrastructure and electricity. Energy. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. The last time I was in this room actually was only a couple of weeks ago, talking about a similar sort of topic from a slightly different perspective. Several of my colleagues have been here earlier in the week, and I should just make it clear that Danny Wood is not related to me at all. She's an economist and I'm not. To mangle Oscar Wilde only slightly, if you look at where we are in the middle of 2017, it seems that to stuff up one energy challenge would be regarded as somewhat misfortunate, but to stuff up three at once would seem to be somewhat careless. And we've had to work very hard to achieve that situation. We have a situation in which all those things that should be going up are going down, and those things that should be going down are going up. And as a consequence of that, the politicians are going around in circles, which isn't necessarily all that productive. But I do want to come back to the topic of this afternoon, which is to talk a little bit about the institutional, regulatory and decision-making foundations that underpin a lot of the issues associated with energy and climate change and energy infrastructure in particular, because there are some themes that are common, and I've, in the last 6 months or so, spent quite a bit of time, not so much with Infrastructure Australia, but more with Infrastructure New South Wales and Victoria, and thinking about not only the energy infrastructure itself, but because work I do at Grattan is interrelated with climate change, the relationship between infrastructure and climate change. When I said that, we've managed to be pretty careless in relation to three areas. The three areas I'm talking about are, firstly, what was going to be relatively simple, that is the economic regulation of natural monopolies, because in my reading, as I said, I'm not an economist, but electricity utility companies, I think, was one of the first natural monopolies to be covered by economic regulation back in almost 100 years ago. And for most of the rest of the 100 years, things went pretty well, and the economic regulation in that sector has generally, I suspect, delivered pretty good outcomes. And for the first little while in Australia, we had the same outcome, but in more recent times, that side has gone off the rails, and we've seen a situation in which we have so-called gold plating of networks, we have very high rates of return, we have an absolute shit fight between the economic regulator and the companies. And the Federal Court and the Competition Tribunal got in the middle of that. Well, we were sort of in the process of eliminating one of them from that process, the Competition Tribunal. So that one hasn't gone so well. The impact of network pricing has been such that in a market that's been falling in consumption, the cost of networks has gone up by 60% in real terms over 5 or 6 years. That would seem to be somewhat contrary to what you would have thought. Secondly, we've had what I've described, and others as well, one of the more toxic political debates in recent history, and that has been around climate change. The battlefield is littered with the carcasses of leaders of parliamentary parties who've gotten themselves into trouble over this, and it may still be one of the things that creates even a second coffin for Malcolm Turnbull. We'll see. And that's been not going very well. Then you've seen what's playing out even today through the Coalition Energy Council and all the stuff that was being discussed around so-called clean energy targets. And then thirdly, just when the consequence of really bad climate change policy, and we had this thing which wasn't really climate change policy, but it was the only thing left that looked like one, when that started to have the absolutely predictable but most unfortunate consequences that we saw happen over the last 12 months, and just when we started to close down coal-fired power stations and think gas was going to be the fuel of transition, guess what? gas prices went up 3 times. So if you really want to line up several things and produce the worst possible outcome in terms of price, in terms of security of supply, and in terms of environmental impact, then this is a pretty good way to do it. So how do you step back from that and think about, well, what is this? How does this work, and how is it supposed to work, and what might happen next? I think, in a way, it's almost obvious when you look at what happened in South Australia when the lights went out, 28th of September last year, that energy underpins a lot of the things we do. Now, the days when, well, the electricity's gone off, get the candles out, and we'll have fun playing games, are well and truly behind us. I mean, the consequences of energy outages are very visible, but interestingly, we still don't seem to be very good at understanding what that actually means, except that when the lights go out, there is a crisis, politicians get involved, and you've seen the consequences of that, culminating particularly in the shirt-fronting, somewhat unedifying, I wouldn't call it a press conference, but unedifying conversation that took place between Josh Frydenberg and Jay Weatherall a few months ago. And that, I suspect, will be almost a permanent YouTube clip for a long time. The institutional foundations of energy are not great. The extent to which we have a COAG Energy Council, which comprises the federal minister and the state and territory ministers as a decision-making body, is a joke. It doesn't work very well, and it can't work very well because they historically have met about every 6 months. They're the body who's supposed to make major decisions on policy. Very rarely would you find the same ministers turning up at 2 consecutive meetings, and many of them have conflicts of interest in terms of ownership, in terms of policy making. And you've only had to see what happened recently when they actually think that ownership conflict of interest is a badge of courage, in terms of what the Queensland government recently did when they said, because their generators were in such a powerful position in the market, their argument was that the prices had gone up, but that wasn't the fault of their generators, that was the fault of the market. And what they then did was direct one of their generators to reduce their prices, to stop behaving commercially and deliver lower prices for consumers. And they did, and they're saying, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that the advantage of government ownership? Now, if that's where we're heading, then anyone who thinks about public policy in this sense would be scratching their heads about where the hell we're heading. So I think the fundamental governance structure of the energy sector is a challenge. And more recently, the Finkel Review recommended some changes. So he's inserting an extra layer between the COAG Energy Council of Ministers and the 3 bodies that, broadly speaking, are responsible for the energy market. The market rulemaker, the Electricity Market Commission, the operator and the regulator. And we'll see how that works, although I think if you'd been a fly on the wall inside the COAG Energy Council meeting last Friday, you would have heard a lot of concern about this structure and to what extent state governments would relinquish control. So there's some of the institutional side of this, I think, is not particularly strong. And the model that we adopted for this structure, which largely was towards the end of the 90s, and which served us pretty well for most of the time since then, is fundamentally being challenged. And, I think we'll see how that plays out, but the extent to which policy and regulation have fallen behind technology and consumer choice is now bleedingly obvious, and that is creating some real tension in the process. So the institutional foundations, I think, are not strong. Secondly, the regulatory foundations are being challenged. I'll give you one specific example. We had a situation in which the decisions around transmission infrastructure, and transmission must be one of those ones which is more like classical infrastructure, it's like the highways of energy, and basically the idea was that decisions on infrastructure would be made on a regulatory basis. That is, it would be made upon, these were going to be regulated monopolies, low risk, low return and so forth. And that would be made by the regulator, or the approval by the regulator. And many of the actual businesses, of course, are owned by the private sector, but not all, because we got stuck on the market reform process when the money ran out on competition payments about 10 years ago. The other side of it, which is the competitive side of the generation sector, broadly speaking, is privately owned, except for the sort of example I mentioned before in the case of famously in Queensland. Although more recently, we've seen both the federal government and the South Australian government talk about re-entering that market and expanding the ownership of Snowy Hydro in the case of the federal government, and also South Australia talking about buying their own gas-fired power station and promising, absolutely promising, we will only ever use this in absolute emergencies, therefore the market should not be worried. If there's anything that's going to worry a market, it's a minister saying exactly that, because you know that's not what's going to happen. You know that's what's going to happen. And so the idea that these decisions on generation will be made by the private sector are actually being challenged as well, because we've now seen governments playing around in that sector, or at least threatening to. And because of what's happened in recent times and the extent to which South Australia has been I wouldn't say a basket case, that's very unfair, but certainly an example of how things can go wrong, we've seen this interface between, well, should we have more generation in South Australia, or should we have more interconnection with Victoria or New South Wales? Now, clearly those two decisions are competing with each other, and yet one's being made on a regulatory basis and one's being made on a competitive basis. So how do markets work with that, and how do regulators work with that is going to be one of the big challenges that will have to be addressed in the next little while. Because at the same time, the concept of centralised large power stations is also starting to dissipate as we see more distributed generation. So there's some really interesting tensions there. And then I think we have to think about what this means for the assets, because most of these assets have got relatively long lives. Now, people assume that, I was just reading in The Economist, I think it must be the week before last, where they were talking about the issue of longevity and how people born today can expect to live longer. Whether that applies to coal-fired power stations remains to be seen. And the idea that they reach this sort of thing called those who are against coal-fired power stations think they describe this thing as their natural life. Well, these things don't have natural lives, they have economic lives, as you would know more than I would. And so we've got this weird definition of, well, they should be shut down when they reach the end of their life. Well, I didn't start in this industry, I started in the fertiliser industry in my professional career. And the fertiliser plant that I worked on back in the late 1970s, my first job, was built in the mid-60s and is still running, perfectly happy today. And no one talks about shutting it down because it's old. So there's some interesting value propositions playing out, which are sometimes translated into economic propositions, and I think that's dangerous. And so finally, talking about this issue of, well, value for money. How do we think about the value of electricity and energy? Now, coming back, I started by referring to Oscar Wilde, and I'll finish by referring to Oscar Wilde. The idea that we know the cost of everything, the value of nothing, I think is playing out here very well, because it turns out that we don't actually understand very well what's the value of electricity. There was an attempt a few years ago to calculate something called VOL, the value of lost load. That is, what does it actually cost when we lose electricity? Anyone who's ever looked at that work would say it's laughable in terms of the rigour in which the analysis was done, because it's bloody hard. Because the so-called energy trilemma that the government talks about, and many others do as well, in terms of basically trying to balance affordability and security of supply and sustainability, doesn't work all that well when you've got... people will normally say, well, how valuable is electricity? Well, they'll value security more than anything else if it's only recently they had to throw out the contents of their fridge. They'll value price if they've just seen the latest electricity bill and it's gone up 20%, which many people in New South Wales would have seen if they've seen an electricity bill in the last little while. And if they're very fundamentally concerned about the environment, they'll also value that very highly all the way through. So that's a real tension, and I don't think we've really yet understood how we think about the economic value that electricity and energy provides to us in the 21st century. And until we do, I think we're going to struggle with the fundamentals of how we think about energy infrastructure as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for, as usual, a very uncontroversial take on infrastructure and energy. Now, I have the opportunity as the chair to start off with the first question to the panel members, and we have lots of time for you to be engaged. As I said before, we're talking, I can't remember, was it 200 million or 600 billion? I can't remember, give or take a couple of $100 billion. We're talking about a lot of money, a lot of infrastructure. Also in terms of impact on daily lives, we're talking about some very fundamental things, both in terms of people's regular monthly bills and their daily experience of what are essential services. So a great topic. What I was thinking to do for the first question was to try and pull together the themes that came out of our two guest speakers. So people who were here the first 2 days would have seen Carol Graham. She was talking about well-being in the sense of happiness and work she'd been doing between different countries and different parts of the US. And Kip Viscusi, who also was doing work about value of statistical life. And now, this might seem a bit tangential, but one of the things that came out of both those questions, which is a bit of a tricky one, was equity issues. So you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking at programs. To what extent, I suppose, do you think that, and we're looking at foundations for wellbeing, we're looking at infrastructure and equity issues? I mean, it's always a particularly pertinent issue for politicians. It's for particular electorates, but do you think we've got those foundations right? Or is it a work in progress in how we're looking at equity issues with infrastructure? So do you want to make a start?
Yeah, I think, it's a big topic and I think it's certainly something close to our heart. We, as part of our role, we look at the cost-benefit analysis provided by a proponent on a project, and that's certainly something that the equity issues are something we want to see coming through that process, and we do on varying degrees, as I said, depending on the quality of the work. The other component, though, in terms of equity is which is particularly a problem in Australia, is we've got a high proportion of our GDP generated in our cities, 79-80%. But then we've got some of the remotest communities on the planet, and I think that's often something that gets played back to us, particularly from some of the smaller territories like the Northern Territory, in terms of how do you look at projects in the Northern Territory, for example, with the same kind of equity lens as you do in the capital cities, and that I think that definitely is a work in progress. I think there's been some good work looking at some of those broader social issues, but I think it's still a work in progress. Yeah. So I'd be keen to hear from the audience in terms of what their kind of views are on that. But that, these are things that we're challenged with, certainly in the work we do. Okay. Yeah.
Tony, do you have a...
There was a Choice did a consumer survey last year, and one of the results that was fairly widely publicised was that over 80% of consumers had a view that, in terms of impact on their day-to-day budgets, that electricity was the biggest issue, a bigger issue than mortgages, a bigger issue than health. That obviously is, whether you would do the analysis to decide that they should feel that way or not, it's an interesting question, but that was the conclusion. And part of course, the reason is it's so much publicity in the media. A couple of examples where I think this issue is becoming quite difficult, and that is, there's this issue of the extent to which energy is an essential service. And, largely there have been lots of cross-subsidies locked into the energy system, partly because of energy was used by state governments in particular as an instrument of regional politics. And so if you want to support communities in regional Western Australia and Queensland, one way to do that was to have highly subsidised electricity prices. Now, both of those states have got a really nasty problem in terms of trying to think about what they do in terms of unscrambling those cross-subsidies, which are big equity issues. Secondly, as we make this transition towards the sort of system we might be having, what's pretty obvious is that, except for there are some exceptions to what I'm about to say, because some people are more than prepared, because of their own value positions, to allocate a substantial amount of money to what they think will improve the environment. Whether that's economically accurate or not doesn't matter. That's their strong view. But generally, the situation is that those who can't afford to make the transition to, say, solar PV and batteries are being subsidised by those who are subsidising those who can, and we are valiantly resisting doing something about that. State governments basically have vetoed attempts by the national regulatory bodies to introduce cost-reflective network pricing, which would help fix some of those sorts of things. And one of the more extreme examples I'll finish on, Robert, is only last week, no, I was told this week, so I think it was an LNP conference in Queensland on the weekend, where, and you may have seen this was reported, I think, yesterday or the day before in the newspapers, was that a motion to socialise the cost of electricity. And the reason for this is that electricity prices are becoming so serious in terms of the impact on small business. The governments who currently provide support for consumers on low incomes basically should provide support from the budget for businesses, small businesses. Now, I'm not sure where that goes and to what extent that would be adopted, but we're getting into some pretty scary territory in terms of challenging some more important fundamentals. And I grew up in Queensland, although I live in Melbourne these days, and I'm old enough to actually have met Joe Bjelke-Petersen. He would be cheering in his grave if he heard what I just described. Cheering in his grave.
All right, so you started out with catnip for economists in cost-reflective pricing, and then you just took it the other way. Now the next one, really what we're trying to do here is just burly the water a bit so we can more questions from the audience. So this will be my last one. Again, based on what's been happening in the conference to date, there was a very interesting session yesterday about economics of regulation and how it's put together. And one of the speakers who's been on a recent New South Wales review spoke about digitalisation and running that a bit into sort of, if you like, more an overall technology piece. So, to what extent most of what we're looking for in the infrastructure piece, and when people is back to those sort of big chunky pillars we talked about. There's sort of the beautiful big power poles running off into the distance. There's sort of umpteen lane highways, and sort of the big ports. Is there a chance that there is a get out of jail free card or a stopgap there, the technology and digitalisation, or are we sort of, is the hype running ahead of the reality in that space? So I'm not sure whether you've got too much to say about this or whether you feel it, but if you want to start off, Phil?
Yeah, perhaps a couple of things. One, in terms of the technology and regulation, I think one of the things I mentioned, our 15-year plan, one of the things we're clear about is, and this may run in, Tony might respond to this in terms of energy, but we're clear that regulation needs to keep out of the way of technological change, and that's kind of one of our philosophies. But broadly, in terms of technology, I touched on it in my remarks. And I think, with the advent of so much data, our ability to understand the whole supply and demand relationship between our infrastructure is much greater than we've ever had before. The problem, and that's helpful with so much potential disruption coming along from renewables and other things. So we actually, more and more, we've got the tools to actually understand what's happening, and I think that's helpful. In terms of the investment side of things, though, we're still, the perplexing and frustrating thing is a politician would still rather go and build a new transmission line or a new highway than actually spend money on optimising an existing asset, and that's a reality, and that's where we're at right now. So, we're very focused on that, and that's coming back to what I was saying about options assessment as part of developing a business case. We're pushing that really, really hard at the moment.
Okay. Tony?
I think there's been a lot of, not surprisingly, a lot of discussion, debate about the climate benefits of wind and solar. I'm not sure I'm not a great fan of the word renewable energy, but it's a bit of a shortcut, I suppose. Because when you think about it, coal is renewable, you just got to wait long enough.
Yes.
And solar is nuclear. It's just the nuclear power station's a long way away. But we use labels anyway. So I'll use labels, having apologised for using them. What has been talked about more recently, of course, and quite provocatively, has been the consequences of the intermittency that goes with wind and solar. Now, that's not necessarily a characteristic of renewable energy, or energy that has effectively near zero emissions is a better way to describe it. But wind and solar certainly have that characteristic, and dealing with intermittency has been one of the big issues that the government's been having to face. The one that doesn't get so much discussion is that these sources of energy effectively have near zero marginal cost. And it sort of sounds like some of the proponents of renewable energy, the most vigorous ones, would say, well, look at this, the energy's free. Isn't this wonderful? And when you the more renewable energy you put into the system, the lower the cost. Well, sorry, that's not fair. The lower the price. And as you would know more than I, there's a very big difference between price and cost, although many people, certainly in the media, deliberately or sometimes inadvertently confuse the two. So as we see more zero marginal cost supply coming at us, the consequences for two things are quite dramatic. I mean, I did some economics at university early on, and I used to grapple with these curves, right, of supply and demand, but I never had to deal with one that was flat. Zero. And you think about how that works and what happens to wholesale markets, spot markets and contract markets, and how this all evolves, it's both interesting, it's fascinating and challenging. So how our system responds to this, when we think about the Uberisation of energy in the same way that other things are already going this way, and some of you I'm sure would have read the works of Jeremy Rifkin, who's written about the zero marginal cost society. He uses energy as an example. The consequences are much more profound than the simple tagline of zero marginal cost. So I think this is coming at us, it's coming at us as a community, it's coming at our regulators and coming at our governments, and they're not even thinking about it yet.
Okay, yes, so that was the zero margin reminded me, someone pointing out to me once that you can have renewable energy for shipping in yachts, so it's zero marginal cost for wind, but then doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets a yacht. Now, chance for questions. Excellent. I need to just check at the back if we have a microphone.
Yes, someone's going to be...
I can do the microphone. I'm happy to do the microphone. So just... And I haven't checked, but I'm pretty sure no question is too hard, too simple, or too...
It might be too hard. We'll be the judges of that.
We'll take one at the front. Walk through the front.
Brad Routing, Productivity Commission. Does Infrastructure Australia do ex post evaluations of projects, and more broadly, are governments doing enough of that sort of thing?
I'll take the second part of the question first. No, and actually, we strongly believe that Commonwealth funding of state infrastructure projects should be contingent on not only publishing business cases but completing post-completion reviews. We're actually doing some work on defining what we'd like to see in those in terms of benefits realisation and the broader outcomes, and that will be built into our own assessment framework at the end of this year, and we'll be pushing that hard, so any support you can give us on that is good. Do we do post-completion reviews ourselves? No, not at the moment. There's no compulsion on project proponents to give us the data to do so. The Department of Infrastructure in Canberra, though, has done some of these over the last year or so. So it's not fair to say none of it's being done. There is some work being done, but it's by no means public. That the data's not available, so it's pretty hard to learn.
Now, again, you're rewarded for how close you came to the front. So
They're all shuffling forward now.
David Prentice from Infrastructure Victoria. I've got actually two questions, or comments. One is on the equity issue. An additional dimension of equity sort of was made apparent to us when we were doing our work on transport pricing, was when you start to price things that haven't previously been priced, and this has been very much a trend in infrastructure, this creates complications for particularly low-income earners, and this has already risen in Victoria in water and electricity, and water seems to do it well and electricity seems not to do it so well, but it seems to be an important dimension to think about when thinking about equity associated with developments in infrastructure. The second point was about the zero marginal cost. This also seems to be an extreme case of technology that generates natural monopoly. So it seems like there is already quite a bit of thinking. I mean, the extreme case is basically, fixed costs, declining marginal costs. Well, this is just instantly declining marginal costs. So things like fixed equivalents of two-part tariffs, where basically a fixed charge for access to cover would seem to be the way around that. But unless I'm missing something, that was immediately what came to mind.
On that one, we already have a little bit of the mechanisms in place now. For example, even though all of the electricity in the system today is bought and sold through the wholesale market, which is the spot market, and it's an energy-only spot market, there is also, to protect themselves against high prices, even though there is a market cap on prices, the retailers do enter into hedge contracts with people like Snowy Hydro to do that. Other parts of the world have introduced mechanisms that we don't have in Australia called capacity markets. And so basically you see, you have generators who are being paid a certain amount of money on a fixed basis, and they can still bid into the market. We have what's called the reserve trader mechanism in Australia, where the regulator will pay somebody to sit out of the market and just be there in case they're needed. But we don't have this capacity market. Now, Alan Finkel in his recent review suggested we should look at that. There's a lot of pushback on that. Many people would say we don't need that because the market will deliver enough price volatility, so new investment will take place without the necessity for that. But I guess the underlying question is, as you move from a system that's based upon bidding, not always marginal cost, but fundamentally based on marginal cost, to one where you've got a lot of fixed costs, do you just gradually see a transition towards contracts and possibly auctions versus wholesale spot market? And that's, at the moment, I think we're poised to see which way we should go. I don't think there's any answer to it, but I think there's going to be quite a debate. And I know that both the Federal Government Department, Treasury, and also the Australian Energy Market Operator are having a very hard look at, even if they do everything that was recommended by the Finkel review, will we still be left with this problem of, does the national wholesale market provide enough price signalling for new investment? That's where I think it's not sort of a today problem, but it's not very far away. We need to be doing some serious thinking, because Alan Finkel came back when he did a trip recently around the world to look at this and said, everybody in the rest of the world seems to have a capacity market, why don't we have one? So I think that'll be one of the big leftovers from his report.
I might take the first question, and thanks, Tony, for taking the second one, which you're much better placed to take than me. In terms of the first question, though, around equity and reform, I think we've certainly been very focused on this from a road reform perspective, and as you know, we recommended in our 15-year plan that the government look to hold an inquiry into looking at different ways to pay for roads, and they actually responded to that, and as we understand it, going to appoint an eminent Australian to conduct such a review. In terms of the equity issues, there's a couple of considerations, I think, and we're actually doing some work on this currently, which we can talk about offline, but it's important to understand first and foremost, like everything else, what the problem is we're trying to solve. So actually the current way we pay for roads has an equity issue, because people in the bush are paying as much to drive on a relatively poor quality road often as somebody living in a city who's actually costing the economy more through congestion and potentially damaging the road more even. There isn't equity between the people using the road and who pays for it right now, but part of our challenge is to explain that problem to the community, and that's one of the first things we think the inquiry into road reform needs to look at, explaining simply how do we pay for the roads today, and what are the equity issues today, and then exploring, ultimately then exploring different ways to pay for the roads, which I think our point of view on that is you replace the current excise and rego and other tax payments with a user pays kind of arrangement, and then look at the equity issues with that, because there'll be different equity issues, and potentially you might look at CSOs or welfare payments to provide a greater degree of equity. But that's kind of second guessing what that inquiry would look at. But they're the kind of things we were thinking about.
Paul Burke from ANU, thanks for the session. The Deputy Prime Minister has recently expressed a critique of cost-benefit analysis, in particular the difficulty of quantifying benefits for visionary projects that will have benefits and perhaps costs well into the future. So I'd just like to invite a comment on that. And if I may, a second question is another interconnected to South Australia. Is there currently work being done on that in terms of cost-benefit analysis? Thank you.
Yeah, I guess nation-building prime ministers sounds like a dangerous term to me. And Utopia would have more fun than that than I think we would. Look, I think anyone who saw this week's episode of Utopia about the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund would have seen some parallels with what's actually happening at the moment, and the idea that we will build a coal-fired power station in North Queensland. A, we don't need one. B, if we did, we wouldn't build it in North Queensland. C, if we did, you'd have to get the government to finance it probably under a 40-year power purchase agreement. And D, that would seem like an absurd waste of public funding. So, but I mean that, people still have a very strong belief that Snowy Hydro was a tremendous nation-building project. And you talk to the people who run Snowy Hydro and they say, well, if you did it today, you wouldn't be able to justify it. There are better ways to produce what it does than what we built. But maybe it had other benefits that the Deputy Prime Minister knows about.
There was an episode of Utopia that actually said exactly what you said.
Oh, really? Well, there you go. I should confess, by the way, that we do every now and again have a conversation with Rob Stitch about the sort of things that he might do on his program, and he confesses quite absolutely that he couldn't make it up. A lot of the things and many of you would know more about these sort of things than I would, because there's things hidden under the bed. So I think this sort of nation-building idea, the idea of, and transmission lines are like that. I mean, there's a current proposal very strongly supported by the previous Premier of Western Australia to build a gas pipeline from Western Australia. And again, Rex Connor, if he was in the same grave as Joe Bjelke-Petersen, which is an interesting thought, would equally be sort of cheering, right? Now, it seems to me, again, this is one of the last things you would do at the moment, because when you've got such uncertainty around where this is all heading, in terms of uncertainty, you still make decisions, but you don't make decisions that lock you into a future. I mean, one of my colleagues described it as a herd of stampeding white elephants, the sort of thing that we're hearing in some places of government. And so, if you're going to build a gas pipeline or a power transmission line, you're talking about 40, 50-year lifetimes. Now, you do the cash flows on that, and they can sound pretty cheap on a unit basis, but that assumes a level of occupancy which, leaves people who try and finance roads under toll systems sort of almost blushing. And they're pretty bad sometimes. So the problem is that it would be almost certainly, people sort of scoff at the idea that AGL's proposing, that is to import by ship LNG from Western Australia to Sydney or Melbourne. It's probably not a bad idea compared to building a pipeline, because at least it would be flexible. You go and hire a ship for a couple of years and send it away when we finally realise that actually taking gas out of the ground isn't such a dangerous thing after all. We've got heaps of it, we're not about to run out. So I think the flexibility becomes more important. And the guy who did the very recent, John Tamblin, who was previously head of the Australian Energy Market Commission, did the assessment for the government, the federal government, on duplicating Basslink. Now, that was triggered partly because some of you may know that Basslink failed. This time last year was about when it was repaired, but it failed. The undersea cable to Tasmania, and the Tasmanian government had to import a couple of hundred diesel generators just to keep the state going. So you can understand why they did it. Conclusion was this looks like a dumb idea. The only way it would possibly make sense would if you built a very large quantum of wind farms in Tasmania and had nothing else to do with it except send the power into Victoria. Otherwise, and it would take probably 10 years to build and commission, and by the time you got there, there's a good chance you wouldn't need it, because it seems to be counter to the idea that we're having distributed generation, and the idea of building big interconnectors is no longer the model that we should be adopting. So my suspicion is that all the noise that was... Now, there was a proposal to do that work you talked about, a second a transmission line from South Australia to New South Wales. One of the things that got everybody hot and bothered was, that means that South Australia will be able to get access to cheap electricity from New South Wales. And I think the New South Wales Premier or Minister at the time said, well, I don't think so. So that's when you really find out that we're not actually a single country, we're actually a set of several countries that actually compete with themselves in ways that are somewhat unedifying. So I don't know whether I honestly don't know whether that work's proceeding, but if it is, I'd be hesitating before we put a lot of money into it. The other one, by the way, finally, is, more interestingly, is the idea of what are called scale-efficient network extension. That is where you've got a part of a region or a state with a very high potential for wind and solar. There may be an economic case for intrastate transmission to bring that, rather than trying to build one wind farm here, another one over there, and a solar farm here. There may be a case for that. But that's something that Finkel's put up recently. But the other one I haven't heard. It went so quiet that one suspects that it might have quietly died.
I might just add a couple of things to that without duplicating what Tony said. I think, are we seeing business cases for interconnectors and gas pipelines? We haven't yet. I'm sure there's some work being done. I know there's work being done on a pipeline from Northern Territory to Queensland in terms of a gas pipeline, but we haven't seen anything. In terms of the vision, there's nothing wrong with politicians having a vision. I think that's good, but we actually need to make sure the vision is turned into a plan, and that we gather the evidence to develop the plan and then follow through the normal development process to understand what the right solutions are. But I think it's good that we have vision. The only other thing I'd add is I think part of the problem, particularly with the energy market and generally because of the federation, is we haven't necessarily done a great job, I think, at looking at the resilience of some of our networks and systems, and that's both at a state level and a national level. I think there's more work to do there. We kind of have these knee-jerk reactions when something goes wrong, but we're not actually stepping back and looking at resilience, would be my point of view.
Yeah.
Apart from the policy wisdom and the background there, I did tape Utopia. Very good tip.
It wasn't that good.
Oh, okay.
Philip Norman. Just a question for Tony about the value of lost load. I think there may be a lot of people who are happy to sit at home with the candles and a cup of cold tea and maybe some cards, or maybe think about making a few more babies for the grandchildren. So isn't there some way we can use all this big data and electronics to somehow test the appetite for residents for interruptible contracts? And maybe there were some messages in the failure of the big corporates to take interruptible or to accept interruptible contracts in the South Australian fiasco.
I think it's a bit like, it seems to me part of that issue is the one that we talked a little bit before about developing technology and the sort of whole Uberisation of stuff, right? So I think you're absolutely right. The number of consumers, business or household, who would actively be interested in engaging on their electricity consumption on an hour-to-hour basis every day is, I think, very tiny. I mean, any of you who are customers of a retailer called Power Shop may very well use their app, and it's very clever. But the time it takes you to save 50 cents a day, I suspect, is probably a bit high relative to most people. But I think the technology is the answer. I think there will be more and more opportunities for that sort of thing. And so some of you may have seen a German company called Sonnen, who is now putting together a proposition that if you have solar PV and batteries, they will do a deal with you in which you'll get basically $50 electricity a month. That's it, all you can eat, basically. And they will handle the interface and they will give you the assurances about security of supply. Right today, I suspect there are many middle-sized manufacturers, and I had the somewhat interesting pleasure of talking to Eddie Maguire on Triple M about this yesterday morning, because their company was looking at a 70% increase in their electricity bill. There are some companies that say, listen, you know what? I reckon I'd put up with the risk of losing electricity every now and again if I could get my price down. And most of us know that if the electricity goes off at 3 o'clock in the morning for 5 minutes, most of us, digital clocks just reset themselves. You don't even know it happened. But equally, there are times when it is nasty. And so the technology to manage that and to ensure that we don't end up losing what we really value and we're prepared to sacrifice things we don't value so much is going to become far more interesting. And that's where I think we'll see the real challenges to the current structure, where you've got very large retailers who don't actually, retailers don't necessarily add all that much, but innovation in that will come from this direction. And I think that will be, what you're talking about will be part of that.
So I can't resist putting an old hat on. First of all, I think if someone here was from AEMO, there is a reasonably number of large interoperable contracts in the market, some formal, some on the market, and some between retailers on foot. The other one is, and this is a vote, anyone who did have a shower this morning, I presume people did, if you used off-peak hot water, you've actually been using an extremely long-running, very successful demand management tool that's been done across the state. So sometimes we look to what's new and shiny and positive, and we sort of miss actually we're doing something smart without noticing. Anyway, next question, I think. We're working our way along the road.
Again, keeping on electricity, this is not my area of expertise. That's the first thing. But it's always seemed to me that what we did was, amongst the many, many things that have gone wrong, and you're quite right, there's been all sorts of toxic politics and all sorts of irrational policy. But amongst the many things we did wrong is, from a market design view for the national electricity market, we built it around an expectations of a particular technology. This base load coal would do it, and we fill in the gaps when needed with a little bit of gas. And what's founded out ultimately has been simple technological change, which has made that market structure and that grid structure following on from it unsuitable for the coming and arriving technologies. Do you think that's a reasonably accurate picture?
I guess there's a lot of truth in that, but of course, like many areas of public policy, hindsight is an incredibly powerful tool. Not many people would have foreseen the extent to which the cost of solar PV would come down in cost and continues to come down in cost. And to the extent that, a lot of large industrials are now themselves putting in solar PV in their own facilities, because it does more than households. The output of solar PV matches the activity of a business than it does, many businesses, than it does households. So I think you're absolutely right that there's an important principle here, is to sort of, what are the assumptions that we are making that we haven't thought about? And that's a really hard question, because we often don't know the assumptions we're making. So the assumption that demand was continue to rise was an inherent assumption that was made by those who projected the need for continuing to build a bigger and bigger network, and that peak demand would continue to rise. We kept building it, and then when we discovered that, oh my goodness, these prices are going too up, we had a pretty hard look at what was going on, we realised we'd overbuilt it. Now we have a problem with almost certainly assets that are overvalued against what consumers want and need and would prefer not to pay for. But the regulatory compact, the market structural issue, was that they would be low risk, low return, and it's very difficult to turn around and say, guess what, we're now going to hit you with a regulatory write-off of your assets. That would be an extremely provocative thing to do, and you can imagine screams of sovereign risk coming from all over the place, but the reality is that's what's happened. And
It wasn't sovereign risk, it was technological risk.
so the technological risk that is now challenging the existing infrastructure and the existing market structure is coming at it very fast. And the point I made before is that it's way ahead of where the policy and regulation is. And we may have an opportunity to start to catch up, but that's why I think continuing to think, give you an example. Right now, the Minerals Council is running a campaign to say we need some more continuous dispatchable baseload coal-fired power stations. And the idea is they think it's going to be cheap. Well, the problem is that a modern coal-fired power station probably isn't cheap anyway. So, but I could only agree with you that we certainly have not got it right. But it's still not clear how the role of storage is going to play out, for example, because the somewhat infamous Elon Musk battery it's going to be connected to a particular wind farm. It will be charged or discharged from that wind farm in about half an hour. So if the wind stops blowing for half an hour, that's fine. But if the wind it's still blowing after half an hour, then the battery doesn't help you very much. So, the technology still isn't there to smoothly take us where we've got to go. But it's certainly challenging the existing system, and how we manage. Destructive capitalism comes to the fore here. How we manage the destruction of what's there today, but start to construct what we need into the future without destroying things in the middle is going to be a big challenge. And that's why you see all the politics around, how terrible renewables are because they're the problem. Well, no, they're not. It's the problem you mentioned is the problem.
Before we take another question, we will. I was wondering if we might get fill in on technological change, and you can pick whatever everyone you want. But again, you might just pick on Elon Musk as well. He's going down that track. With maybe emergence of electric vehicles and connected automated.
That's like a Dorothy Dix. Thanks for that. No, that's a good segue actually. I was in a very interesting meeting actually with the National Transport Commission this morning talking about the advent of autonomous vehicles and how we're preparing for that, which is not a dissimilar conversation to the energy one. But actually, one of the areas we're particularly interested in, which connects the two, is the convergence of batteries, electric vehicles, and renewable, or, you don't like renewable, but I'll say it anyway, renewable energy and solar PV particularly. So we're having a think about that at the moment in terms of what is the vision of that? What does it look like? What's it going to mean in terms of regulation, and what's it going to mean in terms of, how does it impact those markets? That then runs interference with kind of the whole. We then start to think about how we charge for our roads. We're heading towards a space where we've got vehicles moving around with nobody in them. Call up a vehicle, it's an electric vehicle, it's got a battery in it. It's a whole different world to regulate. And going back to the conversation I was in this morning, that conversation was around who on earth are the regulators for this? Because you're bringing together different, in terms of our current market silos and structures, you're bringing a whole different scenario to the table. And then if you start to think about vehicles that have, delivering goods. You could have a drone coming out of a vehicle, and then you're getting into the airspace as well. You just put your hands up and go and hide under the doona. That's my expression of the day. So I think, but actually we can't bury our head in the sand. These things are happening right now. It's not, who'd have thought a couple of years ago we'd be having autonomous vehicle trials? Who'd have thought we'd have so many electric vehicles? This is happening right now. We need to be planning for it. And it, from an infrastructure point of view, has a very fundamental impact on the planning for future infrastructure, because we don't actually know what it is we're planning for, which comes back to the vision question again. So this is front and centre for us at the moment, thinking about this kind of convergence.
The chairman of the ACCC recently commented that, in fact, privatisation had seen its day out, at least I think mainly referring to ports privatisation. But I'd be interested in your comments in the light of the discussion we've been having about technological change and the unknown future of sort of costs and subsidies and all that kind of stuff in this, and sort of market modelling in an unknown or sort of regulatory market modelling in an unknown technological future, whether you would find a sort of what your views would be about a public ownership, or whether you think that's going to happen in a crisis situation anyway, or where you've got sunk cost, sort of dead assets, or whether whether the economies of scale and so on, or the sort of supply structure is going to be such that public ownership becomes an inevitability, or whether the federal system still weighs like a dead weight on that.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a very open question, but
Well, I think it's a very important question, actually, because, we started, the Hilmer Review started this process back in 1993, and we never finished what we started even then, because we still ended up with government ownership. And of course, it's now become quite a difficult political decision. So the new Western Australian government was elected on the basis of not privatising the network businesses, despite the fact that the facts show that privatised network businesses run more cheaply than do publicly owned network businesses. Now, in New South Wales, we'll see how this plays out. Now, part of it, of course, is you can have inefficient publicly owned enterprises and inefficient privately owned enterprises. It's the quality of the regulatory structures that makes the big difference, and we haven't been well served, I would suggest, in the past by the quality of the regulatory structures. The more challenging one now is to what extent are we going to follow the UK down a centrally planned situation in which it may not be that the government owns everything, but the government owns all the risk. So if the government, as it has done in the UK, underwrites, they're in the process of basically underwriting a contract for power offtake from a nuclear power station, twice the size of the Hazelwood power station that shut down recently in Victoria. The bill's currently gone past £18 billion at a wholesale price which is about twice the current wholesale price until 2058. Now, the private sector may very well own the power station, but all the risks are owned by the taxpayers through the government. The same thing we can see already, for exactly the reasons you mentioned. Governments feel spooked. Governments feel if the lights go out, they're going to be blamed anyway, so they might as well own the bloody thing and do something about it, right? So you can see how that tension's setting up. And my major concern about it is not to say whether one's better than the other, but really to say, let's make sure we do this consciously. If we are seriously heading in that direction, we should take a very, very deep breath before we actually go down. What we don't want to find is in 5 or 10 years' time and we say, how the hell did we get here? This isn't what we planned. Because we have, in principle, we had adopted the idea of competition, deregulation, privatisation as the model to deliver economic benefit. Suddenly we've had partly because we, for reasons we've already talked about, didn't do a great job in very recent times. We've forgotten a lot of that history. Do we really want to go back? Would we go back to the same place? Let's make sure we do it consciously. That would be my concern.
I think I'd perhaps add 4 things to that. One, we actually need to fundamentally get back to a reform agenda, and so that would be one comment. Another is just reinforcing the point for regulation to adapt and be agile and move with the times. I think fundamentally, though, we've got to get the planning right, and we need to think through these different scenarios and think through the planning, and then from to your point around privatisation, we're very focused on getting greater contestability in delivering services, and I think my sense is this is going to be a much higher order up the agenda in coming years, where actually, particularly from an infrastructure perspective, the cost of delivering the infrastructure is peanuts. It's the operational costs, the maintenance costs of the infrastructure that's actually going to kill us, and we need to have a much greater focus on delivering more efficient services through the infrastructure and getting the maintenance and operations right. And I think particularly, if you look at the cost of delivering health and education services, that's, in the kind of federal budget, that's certainly an increasing cost item in the federal budget, which leaves less money for everything else. And I think over time, I suspect there'll be a much greater focus on getting greater efficiency in delivering services in coming years. We're focused on that. We just released a paper on public transport franchising, which was very targeted at that in terms of, presenting evidence of where franchise services are delivering much better, outcomes for users, but also much better value for money outcomes for taxpayers. So I think, that's going to be a much greater focus.
Now we're almost at that time that we had a question here, and we had one at the back. I just feel like, not necessarily distraying that, but to include them in the pack, and we might quickly do that. So,
Okay, quick question. Nikki Hutley from Urbis. The title of this talk is Foundations for Wellbeing, but we haven't really talked about wellbeing or even what that might mean. But taking the definition of our first speaker of the first day, how do you see infrastructure as serving a role in the wellbeing? How do you build that into your cost-benefit analysis? And how broadly, should we be taking account of, social impacts, for example, and having access to, reasonable education, health, transport, all of those things, even electricity. How do you build that into your fundamental models?
So, sorry, Nikki, I obviously didn't address that sufficiently in my remarks, but certainly we're looking for that to come through the cost-benefit analysis and for a better job to be done there in terms of articulating those broader social outcomes. Of course, not everything can be enumerated, but that's certainly something we're pushing. I think, did Robert said, I think that well-being was happiness, and certainly I think one of the things that needs much greater focus is thinking about the broader outcomes from our infrastructure investments, that all too often in the past we've taken a very piecemeal approach to planning infrastructure and projects in particular, and not looked at what they're actually there to do. And I think we've got a way to go to move beyond thinking about railway lines as moving people from A to B, and actually a means of connecting communities and supporting economic growth and urban regeneration in some cases, or actually urban development in others, and supporting jobs and education. I think the sophistication's just fairly immature in a lot of that, as you know, through your work, and I think we're really pushing that through the work we do and the guidelines that we put out. So I think, as we say when we do those roadshows I mentioned earlier, as we say to our colleagues as we go around the country, we're trying to facilitate this and encourage it, but we need everyone's help. So everyone in the room who does this kind of work, we need your help to kind of raise this bar, because it's not an easy one to do. And we often look at other countries in the world, and I spent some time in the UK in October looking at kind of where things are up to there, and quite honestly, we're doing a really good job. We're often beating ourselves up, but the UK's gone right off the rails with some of this stuff. I think the good economists seem to have been pushed to one side, and there's some really bizarre stuff going on there. So we don't want to end up in that kind of situation. I think we want a measured, sensible approach, and we look forward to working with you to do that.
The other very brief comment I'd make on that is that the role of social media and its capacity to enable people to have a voice is incredibly powerful, but equally how you deal with that is also quite challenging. And we see that play out on a number of issues, and the most obvious one at the moment would be around the issue of unconventional gas in Australia and how that's playing out, because clearly there are issues at the very local level of wellbeing that come to the core when the cost is local but the benefit is not. How you deal with that is something we and this is not something we're unique in, are not dealing with very well.
I have to say I'm up to the back because I'm using the electricity PowerPoint down here. My name's Erin Stone. I'm an economic consultant from WA, primarily in regulation and energy. We do have a capacity mechanism, and the market's been criticised primarily for being overly costly. And so we, about 3-4 years ago, the previous government had established a reform priority to look at moving to the national market. Since then, I think we got legislation almost through WA, and then it sort of fell over. Then in sort of March, we had the Labor government take over, and since then, the move to the national market is off the cards. I guess my question is a fairly open one. Do you have any advice to the new Labor government about what you'd do to the WA capacity and energy market at this stage?
I think one of the things that is happening is the responsibility for the operation of the market is going to the same central body that operates the market here, and I think quite frankly they're learning an awful lot as a result of that. I was actually in Perth Monday, Tuesday of this week, and talking to the Minister's office about the challenges they see, and they've got plenty of challenges on a fiscal basis, as you would well know. And I think that the evidence, if you live to be 110 and you had life insurance from when you were 20, you might say, well, that was a bad investment. And that's the nature of this thing, right? I mean, basically, part of the capacity market issue is about insurance and things and paying for things that you may not need. And the problem was, I think, the specific design of the capacity market, they ended up with a lot of capacity which was being paid for, which demonstrably wasn't needed. And so getting that right's the trick. And so there are some opportunities for the beautiful term, the national electricity market, which excludes Western Australia and the Northern Territory, to learn very clearly from how that's worked and not worked in Western Australia, and vice versa. And I know that the government over there at the moment, and this is true of the opposition, they were grappling with this as well, is we have to dismantle part of what we have, and there are some details about that which haven't worked very well, but there are things that we could learn from. So you don't just watch the two trains pass in the night, you actually stop and say, wait a second, let's just have a look what we've learned from each other.
Now, okay, at that point, thank you very much to the audience for the participation in the question and answer. It's been excellent. We've actually run slightly over time, and we made it all the way down to the back of the hall, which was, again, impressive. But I would like you both, I think both presenters will be here for a while if you do want to have a bit of a chat afterwards. But I would like you to thank them in the normal way, and my appreciation for what was an excellent session.